Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 20th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Christian Eulinberg. Hello, what's going on, everybody?
Hey, thanks for joining us. Welcome, everybody, to the 10th annual Hunger Games.
Oh, yes.
Discussion,
yes.
that is.
Yes,
First of all, before we get into it, Christian, thanks for joining me, my friend. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me so much. Like, you know, I'm a big Hunger Games fan. I reached out to JD. I was like, hey, if you need someone to cover the Hunger Games, I'm there. You know, you got to cover this thing sometimes. It gets kind of bloody in the arena, but
yeah,
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to dive in because this is one of my favorite movies of the year. It was one of my most anticipated movies of the year, and yeah, I'm ready to get into the weeds.
Yeah, man, I'm glad that you reached out. It worked wonderfully from a timing perspective because Brendan, as you can see on the video for those watching on YouTube, he is not here for this discussion. He sadly wasn't able to see it in time, but as Christian noted, he reached out. He wanted to be on this conversation, so it was great. I was going to have a partner here to talk to about the newest film within the Hunger Games franchise. It's also a little serendipitous because last year, I believe it was, Christian on his show was doing a Hunger Games retrospective, and I was happy to join him for at least part of that conversation. I can't remember if I just joined for one of the films. I think it was for Mockingjay Part 1.
Yes, you were on Part 1 because we both like that movie.
Yes, I will champion that film. Absolutely.
We belong to the 1% that likes that film.
Exactly, absolutely. And I do want to talk about that here in a moment. But yes, it was great to come on to your show to talk about the Hunger Games and be a part of that retrospective. And we've covered most of the films as they came out in real time here on our show because we started In Session Film back in 2013. So we only missed the one. Catching Fire came out in 2013, of course, in our inaugural year. In fact, that film is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary. In fact, by the time this episode goes live, it might be tomorrow, actually.
Really?
I think so.
Yeah.
I believe so. So we're recording this on the 20th, which is a Monday, and I'm pretty sure its anniversary is this Wednesday. If I remember correctly, I did glance at the calendar not too long ago, and I want to say that is correct. Either way, we're very close to it celebrating its 10th anniversary, Catching Fire, that is. And of course, the Mockingjay films came out just a few years after that. So I am a big fan of this franchise. And I do actually want to set up this conversation, Christian, by talking about our history with this franchise briefly. And then we can get into Songbirds and Snakes. So before we get into the review, give us a little bit of context. Although you've spoiled it already, but what are your thoughts overall on the Hunger Games franchise?
So overall, I read the books as they came out. I was a little bit late to the party because I did watch. I was watching the movies first, and then it's this weird thing where I like to watch the movies first and then go into the book because you know that gives more deeper meaning to the character and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Yeah.
My history with the Hunger Games overall it's been long. It's just ever since it came out. It's just, you know, during that time where authors like new like ideas were coming out just like all over the place. And then it kind of just hit me when I was like, wow, I love this dystopian future, which is something that it's more realistic than most, you know, YA fantasies altogether.
Yeah.
And I don't know, something just draws me to it. You know, the characters are so rich in detail, especially Katniss and especially Lucy Gray, like two of the best written female characters I've probably ever come across. And
Yeah.
yeah, I've loved this franchise as JD knows, but it's something that it's easy to follow. It's not too convoluted when it comes to just the franchise overall. And rewatching the films again, because last year I think was the 10th anniversary of the first movie. And it's like,
Yeah.
man, like,
Last year. Yeah.
yeah, I
I
believe
think that is
so.
correct. Yeah.
And like you had said, it's, you know, I feel like, you know, we don't really talk about the Hunger Games that much because it was like that one last like YA like fantasy like saga or franchise that it still stayed with us because you know we got, you know, that was like Jennifer Lawrence's like big break.
Yeah.
And but it's like it kind of like unfortunately got like lost to time a little bit because as we've talked before, like Harry Potter was huge, you know, like part one, part two, Deathly Hallows, like that was like the cream of the crop. And then, you know, we still had Hunger Games kind of going on around the same time, but it was always in Harry Potter's shadow. But I I'm glad that we're kind of getting back to this like dystopian world of the Hunger Games. And I think we're missing like the dystopian world from just in like genre in general because after Hunger Games like ended, like Divergent came around, Maze Runner, they didn't really hit as hard, and then those fizzled out so
Mhm.
fast. But overall, yeah, to answer your question, big Hunger Games fan, but you know, I'll reserve my Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes thoughts once we get there. But
Yeah.
yeah.
No, well, it's interesting a lot of what you're saying there. Now, I don't have the numbers in front of me to compare it to Harry Potter, and I do agree with you. The Harry Potter franchise was a monster all on its own. However, where I might push back against what you're saying there slightly is that I do think the Hunger Games was quite the monster of its own.
Mm,
So the first Hunger Games makes $408 million in its lifetime gross, $152 million in its opening for a film, a character that many people are being introduced to for the first time. That to me is astounding. Now, perhaps some of it is hindsight because I don't think that film today would come anywhere near those numbers.
right.
Although I might be a little bit surprised with Songbirds and Snakes, but again, it's attached to a character in a franchise that we already love. But $408 million is pretty great. And then Catching Fire comes out and does 424, which is the biggest of them. Mockingjay Part 1, 337, and Part 2 is where maybe people were getting a little bit turned off by the franchise,
Mm,
unfortunately, because I think Part 1 is arguably the best of the films. But as Christian noted, him and I are certainly in a minority there. A lot of others did not love Part 1 as much and perhaps checked out for Part 2 because Part 2 only grossed 281, but still had an opening of 102, which is not terrible by any means,
mm,
especially given when it came out. And you compare that to Songbirds and Snakes, which its opening is only $44 million. So it is quite low comparatively to its predecessors. But those games were huge.
yeah.
They were massive. People talked about them. And as you noted, it certainly launched Jennifer Lawrence into stardom in a whole new way. That coupled with her X-Men films, in addition to all of the Oscar stuff, the 2010s for Jennifer Lawrence, just essays will be written about that for sure. As for the films themselves, as I noted, I love them,
Mhm.
including Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2. I think the franchise is consistently excellent across the board. And I think what's so great about it is that it's as much a meditation into the psychology of revolution as it is an action and adventure series, especially when it comes to Katniss, who becomes thrust into this role of being the Mockingjay, a symbol that people look to for hope. And they did see hope in her, but it's not something she wanted. And she struggles to embrace that as we get to Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2, especially. In fact, there's a scene in Mockingjay Part 2 where she dares a guy to shoot her and put her out of her misery. That's how much of a conflict it was for her. And I love that. I love that Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2 was as interested in the psychology and the emotion and the nuances of these characters as it is in the action and in the adventure elements of it. It's really fantastic. I have argued the same thing about, Infinity War, for example, if we were looking at that in Endgame as a Part 1 and Part 2, or speaking of Harry Potter, Deathly Hallows Part 1 is one of my favorite films in that entire series, because again, it's as much on the psychology of those characters and the nuances, and really get into the depths of their choices before the action and the adventure really wraps up in all of the Part 2s of those series. And I think Mockingjay Part 1 is very much the same in that regard. And it would not surprise me if in another 10, 15 years, it gets a reappraisal and people do start to come around on it. I would not be surprised if that is the case, because it's character driven first. It doesn't care about action and plot in Mockingjay Part 1. It is all about character, and it is riveting material. It's fantastic. And I do like Part 2, even though it does get more into the culmination of it all. But as it relates to President Snow, who's obviously a massive character in Songbirds and Snakes, but as it relates to their dynamic, it's fantastic. And I think it crystallizes impeccably where Katniss decides not to kill him. And I think if she does, it loses all meaning. Her character loses all meaning. And instead, the choice that she makes in giving him up to the people, I think is incredible. It's certainly a testament to the writing, but how that comes through in the filmmaking, how it comes through cinematically, I think is great. And of course, Jennifer Lawrence is very committed to her performances in those movies. And it comes through great. So I'm a huge fan of the Hunger Games franchise, and was very excited for this film. And I think with that, Christian, we can go ahead and jump right into the review here. The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Francis Lawrence coming back to direct, which is fascinating because Gary Ross directs the first film, and then Lawrence comes in for the rest of the series for Catching Fire and then the 2 Mockingjay films. So he is back. This film stars Tom Blythe, Rachel Zegler, Josh Andres Rivera, Viola Davis, Peter Dinklage, Jason Schwartzman, and a slew of others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Songbirds and Snakes, I imagine you're not listening. But just in case, this is about, you guessed it, Coriolanus Snow, who mentors and develops feelings for the female District 12 tribute during the 10th annual Hunger Games. All right, Christian, what did you think about Songbirds and Snakes?
All right. If you haven't already noticed, I've been taken to the streets a lot. As I've mentioned a little bit earlier, this was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and it was, it was that resurgence because we kind of talked a little bit before. It's like, man, the book, and as a book reader, the book came out in 2020, and I was like, man, I would love for them to make this into a movie, but I was afraid at the time. I'm like, I don't know, man. I was like, do people care about Hunger Games as much as like I did? And I was like, maybe not. And then I think it was like a year later they announced it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be amazing. Lionsgate, back at it. Director Lawrence is back at it as well. And I gotta say, this movie is pure as the driven snow. For those who would know, Yes, it is
Yeah.
pure as the driven snow. I love Rachel Zegler as Lucy Gray, Baird and Tom Blythe as Coriolanus Snow. They truly embody these characters, and not even just them. With Viola Davis, Peter Dinklage, you had Rivera playing as Sir Janice Plinth. Like everyone in this movie, and of course Hunter Schafer as Tigress. Like everyone brings their A game when it comes to the storytelling. Like Francis Lawrence, he is a huge Hunger Games fan, obviously, and I
Yeah.
would not want any other director to handle this besides him, because the book is it's long. It's about, I think, 31, 32 chapters. One of those chapters is like an epilogue towards the end. But I mean, even just the music itself, like music plays a huge part in this film. And
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the best like page to screen adaptations that you're going to find. And I know that prequels altogether have not been everyone's favorite so far, with The Hobbit being split up into 3 books, and then we had the those Fantastic Beasts movies. Outside of the first one, I think the first one's actually pretty good, but the Crimes of Grindelwald, of which no crimes he committed, and
No, obliviate to everyone when it comes to those movies.
and the other one, I forgot the name of it, so like that's how much I care about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually prequel movies, and I think Star Wars obviously is like one of the grandfathers when it comes to that. They usually don't do too well. Star Wars is a little bit different because it's kind of an anomaly. Like everyone loves Star Wars altogether, but
But even still, those films were not beloved.
they were
And
not, but now they are.
They're still debated now.
I'm a Revenge of the Sith stand through and through, but
That one
yes.
is great. Yes. You're right.
But-
Not all of them are treated equally.
No,
but
they are not.
broadly speaking.
They are not. But yeah, I think, man, I was so surprised when I saw this, and I was like, in my head, I was like, okay, I'm gonna go see this. I'm like, if there's any franchise that can do a prequel right, it is Hunger Games. I don't know why I thought that, but as soon as the first trailer came out, I was like, oh, this is going to be good. So I reread the book right before the movie came out, and it's so fantastic. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more, but that's just my blanket statement. It's just it's a near flawless adaptation of the book, because I think people can watch this without reading the book, and I think that's when a adaptation has done its job well, is that people can watch something without prior knowledge, because you can technically watch this first and then watch the Hunger Games movies, because the book obviously itself is a prequel, but it stitches and blends so well together with the Hunger Game trilogy novels that it's so consistent, so seamless. Like Suzanne Collins did a great job with making sure that everything worked. There's no loopholes that I can even think of when it comes to the prequel or the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and the Hunger Games movies themselves.
Nice. I haven't read the novel yet. I do hope to get to the Hunger Games franchise next summer, but I really like this film a lot. I'm with you. I enjoyed the heck out of this. I think it's an incredible extension of the series, both in terms of structure and theme, in the sense that it features a Hunger Games fiasco, but as we see more broadly speaking, it's as much about the psychology of these characters and how they contrast each other, which is why emphasizing Snow here is such a fascinating choice, right? Because it's the other side of the coin from what we see with Katniss, where Snow comes from Panem. He has more freedom and privileges. He's an orchestrator of the games, not a victim to them. And most importantly, where Katniss's story was all about her finding her humanity, this is all about Snow losing his. But there are some interesting parallels between the two as well. Snow does benefit from the capital winning the war, but he's not exactly thriving. I do want to get more into that here in a little bit. His life leaves a little bit to be desired in many ways. And while it's not nearly as drastic as it was for Katniss, there does come a moment in this film where he is forced to participate in the Hunger Games. Again, he's coming at it from the other end as compared to Katniss, or in the case of this film, Lucy Gray, but he becomes a part of it in a way he did not expect and is forced to justify his morally gray ambitions, such as a moment of brutal action, I'll say vaguely without getting into spoilers, or cheating in order to give Lucy Gray an advantage, or manipulating the game master, played here by Viola Davis, in order to exhibit Lucy Gray's personalities for donations. All of these things have massive consequences, but he's able to justify it because, one, it will help Lucy Gray survive the games. And two, if he wins, he'll get a sum of prize money that will literally change the trajectory of his life and his family. So there's a lot at stake. And his motives do have credence, even if they're dubious. And I love how the film examines that contrast. This is a 2.5-hour movie. Again, I haven't read the book. I know that there's a lot of material for it to mine. I will say I did not mind its length. At 2.5 hours, I think it flies by. In fact, if anything, I think there are times here where the film could have even slowed down a little bit. I think of the sequence when the tributes first get to Panem. From that moment up until the Hunger Games actually takes place, it does feel a little rushed. We are flying through that quite quickly because we got a lot of story we got to tell here.
Yeah.
And of course, we're going to spend a lot of time in the arena. And the third act is almost a completely different film in and of itself, in a great way, I think. And perhaps we'll talk about that later as well. So the pacing is maybe a little bit uneven at times, but on the whole, I did really like the editing here and how, for a film that's 2.5 hours, you really do never feel its length in that regard. The production design here, I think, is astounding. I love the detail that the Hunger Games is in its infancy, that everything is so raw and underdeveloped. It's like they're still trying to figure out how to make it a spectacle, as we see in the first Hunger Games, which is the 74th, I believe it is.
Yep.
Everything by that point is sharp and crisp, and they have all their I's dotted and T's crossed, and it is this grand spectacle. Not here. This is them figuring it out on the fly. Like it's so rugged and raw, and it just, there's nothing about it that feels pristine. It's certainly not the Panem that we saw previously. And I love how the production design here taps into that idea in a really great way. You talked about the performances. Oh my gosh, the performances here are incredible. The score, the music, it's all really, really fantastic. And yeah, incredible, incredible way to do a prequel. It's certainly one of the best we've seen in recent years, that's for sure.
Yeah, it really is. And like you've mentioned, when it comes to the pacing, that's something I've seen where people have had a few issues. And it's, even though the book and the film are split into 3 parts, because that's how Suzanne Collins just writes. Like, each chapter is just called like chapter 1, chapter 2, but it's like, like the tribute, yada, yada, yada. How many other chapters, the Peacekeeper, yada, yada, yada. How many other chapters it could be. But yeah, when it comes to, I've seen it twice now. So I saw it with it's like our critics, and then I just took my mom and my sister to go see it in IMAX. And if you are planning to see this, see it in IMAX, because it was gorgeous. I absolutely loved it. Obviously, not every single shot is in IMAX, but I would say it's maybe like 60-40, like 40% of the film is in IMAX. And, especially when they hit that arena, Francis Lawrence loves to open up that wide screen and just go for it. And when it comes to the pacing, because the book itself takes a little bit time, it takes a little bit of time to like get its wheels turning, because it's almost like you're reintroducing people to Panem, but this book and the film is set 64 years before the events of Katniss. So, this is a young Snow. He's not evil necessarily. It's not a story where how he becomes president. It's part, they're taking a section of his life where it is almost like a turning point, because he's not innocent, but he does have those selfish tendencies that you see throughout the film, where like his relationship with Dr. Gall, and how she almost kind of grooms him in a way to bring out the side that his father had like a lot of money. And there's also the side where you do see more sincere, that comes really more from like his mother's side. And obviously I'm speaking more from the book, but being a book reader, it kind of enhanced the experience for me. But yeah, it's one of these stories where it's the ballad of songbirds and snakes. So this is a love story overall, where how Coriolanus falls in love with a girl from District 12. He doesn't have the best luck in District 12 altogether when it comes to a lot of things, especially things that happen with his father. But overall, I love how it's a long story, but I think the film just does a great job hitting like every single bullet point, because the first time that I saw it, it's hard not to make those comparisons, but obviously I know that you can't fit everything in to the film, because it would have been 3.5 hours long, because a lot happens after the games, I will say, during the Peacekeeper section, just to keep it more of a spoiler free. But that is where a lot of side plots start happening that converge into one giant plot, and you start to see that display on screen, because I wanted to see it again, as I said, to kind of see if I still felt the same. And I was like, you know what, there's like a few things that they kind of have to gloss over, but I mean, again, sake for time, for the sake of time. But I think it does a great job. Like at first I was like, maybe the third act is a little bit rough on the pacing, and then when I rewatched it again, I was like, oh no, this is actually fine for like a movie. Like, like I said, there's a few small things that I probably would have changed, but like that's small little nitpick stuff for me at least. But it's a spectacle. It really is.
Yeah, so it's interesting how we see this a little bit differently, because the romance to me, I think, is a little bit of a facade. As I noted in my opening thoughts, I think this primarily is the other side of the coin than what we see with Katniss, where her journey was about finding her humanity in a lot of ways. This is all about Snow losing his, and much
Right.
of it is driven around this idea of trust. There's a motif throughout the film regarding this idea that you can't trust anyone. At the heart of the film, it's about Snow's lost humanity, but the blood flow that keeps it beating is that idea of trust and how it crumbles around him, which really begins in those opening scenes where we come to see that his entire childhood is defined by the war between the capital and the districts, or whatever district he comes from. And while his side eventually wins the war, there is a divide created that is fundamental to his convictions evolving over the course of this film. It's further complicated when Snow is up for the Plinth Prize, which would have awarded his family life-changing money, as we noted earlier. But he's told that instead of it being awarded to him because of his grades, the prize will come down to the student who best mentors one of the tributes. So something that should have been a reward for his hard work is simply up for grabs now. And of course, his trust in the system becomes murkier as a result. And as if that would be indignant enough, there's a scene during the Hunger Games where Highbottom, played by Peter Dinklage here, tells Snow that no matter what happens, he's going to ensure that he never wins the prize money. And then there's Lucy Gray, a character that he is forced to build trust with if she is going to win the games, and by proxy, him win the plinth prize. And while on the surface, it appears that they do bond and have some sort of connection,
Right.
is the trust between them just a facade, a way for them to get what they need from each other? Without getting into spoilers right now, I'll just say I think the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that it works both ways. I think you can interpret their trust in each other as selfish and manipulative, but I also think it's fair to argue that it was sincere and genuine before Snow's paranoia got the best of him. Either way, the root of his actions all come down to how trust, or the lack thereof, was pulled out from under him. And it forces this idea that the only one that he can look out for is himself. An idea that permeates through the character in the Hunger Games movies. And I think it's fascinating to see how that is supplanted here. So to your notion earlier about Snow and his antagonism, or at least what we come to know of when he becomes president,
Right.
I do think you're right initially, and I do want to talk further about this. I do think the film wants to posture this question of good versus evil, and the idea that we can be good. He has conversations with Lucy Gray about this. And then we slowly, because of how this trust dissolves, one step after another, beginning as a child, the school this prize being taken away, his actions in the games, everything with Lucy Gray in the aftermath of it, you start to see piece by piece that humanity ripped away. So his choices in the end, in those final scenes that eventually foreshadow who he is as President Snow, you don't necessarily empathize with him, but you at least understand that trajectory. And those contrasts here, I think, are really fantastic.
Honestly, I could not have said that better myself. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, I absolutely love that explanation, because this story, like you said, it can be interpreted in so many ways, because, especially when it gets towards, like, the farther you get into the story, a lot of things are left very ambiguous. So there's so much symbolism in this story within this film that I think that they did a great job translating from page to screen. And everything with Coriolanus, like, he's not used to being in the situation that he's in. He's used to essentially having his cake and eating it too. He tries to keep up appearances, and he's very self-conscious. He's a people watcher, but, like, he carefully calculates when he should and shouldn't jump into certain conversations. And he really does have a silver tongue. Like, he can get by with what he has, but there are times where you see a few cracks, and you see that throughout this film, especially towards the end, where he may slip up here once or twice, but it's almost like, so within the book, you spend a lot of time in Coriolanus's head, and he's constantly overthinking, constantly talking to himself, and just trying to carefully figure out the right thing to say, so he doesn't come across too needy or helpless or too uptight. Like, he really does find that fine line. But even with Lucy Gray, like, as I mentioned, she's a really well-written character. There's still a lot that we don't know about Lucy Gray, even in the books, because she is she's ambiguous in of herself. She's very
You could say that she's gray.
Yeah.
gray character.
All colors lead to gray.
A little bit of a murky character,
Yeah.
ambiguously gray conviction.
Literally. Yeah, it's so
Sorry.
no, that's you hit the nail right on the head. And even, Grandmam, oh, I love Grandmam so much, but she's so pro capital.
Yeah.
She's mentioned she's like she hasn't been a little girl in a long time.
Yeah.
And you can see it on screen. You can see it in Rachel Zegler's performance where
Yeah.
she has this almost like southern twang
Yeah.
to her voice. She doesn't necessarily have that in the book, but it doesn't necessarily explain what type of dialect that she has. But
Yeah. She's definitely from Alabama. Or
yeah,
wherever that is in Pan Am, but
right. I know. But yeah, like it's they use like phrases like ma and pa in the books, but I was like, well, maybe they have a country accent, maybe it's just like a little bit southern. But when it comes to even just Pan Am itself within the districts, it's like obviously they're living a different world between the capital, but when you see the other tributes, like they're dressed in like these like old-timey like rags, and this is like you said, an early Pan Am, but within the districts, it's almost like history's repeating itself. They kind of have like this like folk lore, like Americana kind of look to them, the way that they
very much. Yeah.
the way that they speak and whatnot. And it's so great. I think it's so
She
cool.
looks like she's from Nashville. You would know that.
I know. Well, that goes back to the music. The music here is so important. And I got to tell you, man, I've been listening to
before we get to that.
Okay.
Can I talk a little further about Snow and what you were talking about there regarding his character here? Because I don't want to get too far from that before we get to Lucy Gray and the music. And I do want to talk about that
Yeah,
here
for sure.
in a moment, if you don't mind. And indulge me. Something you said that I thought was really interesting, even though it was in reference to Lucy Gray. It was Snow's grandmam, as you noted, speaking about Lucy Gray, this idea that she hasn't been a little girl in a long time. I think there's some interesting irony to that because it's a notion that applies not to just Lucy Gray, but really all of these characters. And I think that's what I love so much about those opening scenes that we get in this film of Tigress and Snow when they are little kids. They're 4 and 5, 6 years old and trying to survive in the middle of this war that's taking place. It's a little grave of the fireflies. Okay. And I love that the film starts there before anyone had won the war, because it emulates how, not just Lucy Gray, but as it relates to Snow specifically, how he's never really seen the world as anything other than in deep conflict, which is important because it gives credence to the idea that he was always a victim, or at least that's how he sees himself, especially when compared to his peers that we see a little later on. He doesn't have money like his friend Sejanus. His family has no significant status. In fact, he has to wear his father's clothes because he has nothing new to wear, which is why this plinth prize means everything to him. But when that's stripped away, he's forced to wrestle with what is good. Is there anything worth fighting for? And this, to me, is why I push back against the criticisms surrounding this film and its third act, because I think it's so vital in how it demonstrates Snow's deterioration. He might be questioning Pan Am, the importance of the Hunger Games. Is there anything good in this world? But when he goes to District 12, he at least has his friend Sejanus. And he knows that, and maybe this is where we can shift into spoilers a little bit, because I do want to talk about this third act. And in order to do so properly, I feel like we have to at least reveal one character, and that will spoil at least what happens in the arena. So spoiler alert moving forward for the rest of this conversation. because when he goes to District 12, he has his friend Sejanus, and he knows that Lucy Gray is alive and well. So everything is good, right? Everything is good in this world? Well, no, because he's forced at one point to turn on Sejanus when he threatens the possibility of Snow ever getting back to the capital. And of course, he's devastated when he sees what happens to him. There's a moment when a few rebels endanger him and Lucy Gray, to which his rebuttal to that is to shoot them. And because of his scheming and volatile actions, even Lucy Gray begins to see him for who he is becoming and decides to betray him. And all of this compounds upon the moment during the games where Viola Davis's game maker character propels him to go into the arena to save Sejanus, which ends in him killing one of the tributes. So in the end, he's a young man who sees the world as inherently evil, and that the games are just a reminder of humanity's hopelessness. And one of the film's most potent moments, there's this line of dialogue near the end of the film when he walks into a room dressed to the nines, and his cousin, looks at him, to which she replies, "You look just like your father." A line that hits like a gut punch because of a conversation they had earlier in the film when she noted that his father had eyes that were malevolent. It's a powerful exchange that reinforces his lost humanity, that he's become as nihilistic as his father. Francis Lawrence, in an interview, said that when he goes dark, which I think people will find very satisfying, it feels believable and honest and truthful. And I think that articulates it perfectly. This whole idea of lost humanity, I love how it starts early in those opening scenes, how he sees himself as a victim, and how that potential innocence, the good that could be there, that whole exchange again that he has with his cousin, where she says, "Your father had these malevolent eyes, but you don't have to do that. You can be good."
Right.
And again, it poses this dichotomy of good and evil. But because of what happens to him, that distrust that we talked about earlier, how that begins to seep into his life, some of it his own will, some of it not.
Right.
Either way, at the end of this film, all he sees is nihilism, and that humanity is hopeless. And how we get there, I just think is incredible. That, and again, this whole film is about him losing his humanity, but it certainly doesn't happen
Like a snap,
in the blink of an eye. It's all of these things compounding, and I just think it's brilliant.
Yeah, honestly, again, you have killed it. Like, oh my, like if I didn't know any better, if you never say you didn't read the books, I would have thought you actually read the book. Because no, that's
It's in the movie. It's there.
Yeah, it's all there. And talking about his father, like he does mention his mother a few times, but I think that's where the dichotomy is, where and Lucy Gray even says it, like in the trailer, where she's like, we all walk a fine line, like we're all born naturally good, but like it's our job to stay on the straight and narrow, or not try to cross that line. And Coriolanus' father was a very malevolent person, but his mother was very sweet. So I feel like those are the two influences, obviously within his own life. But that shadow for like his father just starts looming over, and like you said, it's these small little instances that keep happening. It's kind of like almost when Anakin falls to the dark side, because it's not just everything that happens in Revenge of the Sith. Like
exactly, that's a great comparison, actually.
Yeah. So it's like everything that happens, like from Anakin being taken away from his mother from like a young age, him witnessing his mother dying, everything happening with Ahsoka and her leaving, the Jedi temple, and then everything with Padme, and then his more just, it's all these small little things that make characters like Coriolanus or Anakin / Darth Vader the people who they are. And
Mhm.
even though, they are inherently evil, you kind of understand how, not necessarily sympathize with them, but you understand how they ended up this way.
Mhm.
And I love seeing characters who, fall into not necessarily darkness, but like, I guess you can say almost like a fallen angel, almost, where, it's almost like either the system has failed them, and they're so driven to make certain things work a specific way.
Especially
And
when you consider Snow in the Hunger Games, who, and I don't necessarily mean this as a negative. In fact, I don't, because Brendan and I have joked, on the show all the time, especially in recent weeks, how I can never use this as a criticism anymore when we see just how evil and cartoonish these executives are. But he is like a mustache twirly villain
yeah,
almost
I
in
love that so
and
much.
and and the Hunger Games, and he's gone to this extreme, but he's also very successful politically. He gets to that position, and maybe if there's a sequel to Songbirds and Snakes, we'll see how he rises the ranks and eventually becomes president.
Right.
But there's clearly a prowess to him in terms of his political angling in order to take over Pan Am and eventually turn the Hunger Games into what they are, and everything that we see in those movies. And it's devastating to me. I think the true reckoning force of this film is that when you think about the character in context and this dichotomy of good and evil that we're talking about here, imagine if there's one swing of the pendulum the other way. If he gets the money, if the if he doesn't lose trust in the system, and they give him what he was earned, what he
Mm,
had done in school, would that have changed him from who he is at the end of this film? Could that good have come out of him instead? It's
mm,
fascinating to think about how powerful he becomes as a character. What if that was a force for good instead of a force for evil? It's this film posits the question that it could have swung in that way, but it doesn't, for all the reasons that we see here and that we're talking about. And I love that thought exercise and how this film provokes that.
yeah, that's a very good point, because I see a lot of other videos. I hate to keep going back to Anakin, but people are like, oh, what if Anakin never fell to the dark side? Like, what would have been the, I guess, the canon events that would have, kept him on the straight and narrow? And, going back to Coriolanus Snow, that's a good question, because, he even talks about in the film, he's like, yeah, like I've got like the best grades in the class. Like, it's reaping day essentially in the capital.
Mhm.
And what the Ballad Songbirds and Snakes does so well is, you get to see the the Hunger Games from the Capitol's perspective, more so. Everything with, Flickerman and whatnot, which was amazing.
Mhm.
But yeah, I often wonder if he were, if Coriolanus were to get what he was essentially owed to begin with, um, would he turn out the way that he does? Because in the books, he is, they are struggling for survival, and he's like, oh, if I just had, this plinth prize, things would be so different. But
Mhm.
then it was, yeah, he had those tendencies, but it's like it didn't start to come out until later on, where things were effectively, yeah, being taken away that he felt like was owed to him, especially what
Mhm.
happened to his father, what happened to his mother, and the family status and the renown that the Snow name had,
Mhm.
across Pan Am.
Absolutely. I love how the film examines all of that. Can I swing the conversation here a little bit? I want to
Yeah.
talk about one of the very best things of this film. And honestly, one of my favorite things about the entire franchise thus far. And it's about the idea of the Hunger Games themselves. So one thing about the Hunger Games movies that wasn't a criticism, but something that slightly irked me is that it never really wrestled with the idea fundamentally that children were forced into an arena to fight to the death. It, of course, reckoned with the morals of it, but mostly, as we noted earlier, it was examining revolution and Katniss's psychological torment, which I absolutely loved for the reasons I noted. But I absolutely love that this film not only brings up the insane lunacy of what the games actually are, but how it started. And again, spoilers here, but there's a scene at the end of the film where Highbottom details how he came up with the idea as a joke in a drunken state. And that to me is astounding because honestly, that's the only true explanation for it. The idea of the games is so brazenly immoral and barbaric that the only way to explain it is that it was born out of drunken stupidity.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that, especially as Highbottom articulates not just the lunacy of it all, but his guilt and grief over it. It was never meant to be taken seriously, but Snow's father didn't receive it as a joke. Instead, it became reality, and Highbottom did everything he could to stop it from happening, which is why Snow's ideas to amplify the games and make it more appealing, something he needed to give Lucy Gray an advantage, ended up becoming a potent and visceral irony as it reinvigorated the games. That duality is so striking here, and Dinklage in that moment is phenomenal, and how he taps into the humanity of Highbottom and the deep, profound remorse he's feeling. That whole sequence, maybe top 3 moments in this franchise for me. I think it's that good and that powerful.
Yeah, even in the books, like it pretty much plays out like the same way where, you know, you find out that there's this vendetta. It's almost like Highbottom is Snape, you know, like always picking on Harry. Like you can't stand him. Snape cannot stand Harry.
It is Snape like, yeah.
And you see it like, I mean, obviously you see it in the film, but like in the books, it is so much more prominent. Like Highbottom hates Coriolanus, like is always giving him a hard time. I'm like, yeah, this is like the Snape and Harry relationship. But yeah, like the whole drunken state thing where it's like when you find out, like, because I didn't even expect that we were going to get an answer for that. And you know, when everything just kind of happens, like Dinklage, you know, says in the film, it's like, yeah, the assignment was to come up with a punishment so strict and so dark and so evil that, you know, our enemies could never ever rebel against us again. And the fact that Coriolanus's father had a hand in that, where he's the one who, you know, just he's like, oh yeah, this is great. And it's like, oh yeah, we worked on this together. And I was like, wow, it's crazy how it shows how careless Panem, or the capital of Panem, can actually be. And you see it throughout like the Hunger Games movies. You see it here where, you know, obviously these tributes are nothing more than tributes. And Flickerman does a great job of just, you know, oh, like they're not even human. And it's crazy to think.
Yeah. And I love that the film is willing to wrestle with that. I don't necessarily mind that the aforementioned movies don't, because it's not as much about the history of the games. But I do love that we're only 10 years into it, that it makes sense for this film to wrestle with it, especially since Highbottom, as we find out, is one of its original creators. And I just love that it's brought up as an idea, he said, as a joke in this drunken state, because how else do you explain a contest that involves children killing themselves to the death? Like, it's so heinous and outlandish that it feels like something you would laugh at, that you would mock.
Right.
However, and I think it speaks to oppressive states in many ways when you tethered that to real history and some of the things we know about oppressive states. Would it really surprise you to learn that this was something that happened in real life when learning about those oppressive states? Probably not, because we see them do crazy things like this all the time.
Yep.
So to bring it up in that regard, I think is fantastic. And you're absolutely right. It does such a wondrous job of recontextualizing the character, because throughout the film, it suggests that his motives are in seeking power and that maybe he sees Snow as a threat because of his intelligence and because of who his father may have been. I mean, as I noted early on, all we find out about Highbottom is that he helped create the Hunger Games, which tells us, at least early on without this context, that he's of some importance. And Dinklage does a great job of portraying disappointment, again, in a way that suggests it's because the games are maybe becoming obsolete. But that's the crazy thing about context. It turns out it's kind of important because in that final scene, we realize his disappointment is actually in Snow, ironically making the games relevant again. And I love the detail that Highbottom not only saved Lucy Gray, but sent her back to District 12 with some of what we can presume is the prize money, which further suggests his guilt and any humanity that he's trying to cling on to.
Yeah. And
incredible.
And he's sipping on morphine, the entire
throughout the film.
Yeah. And it's crazy because, Highbottom was just hoping. He's like, okay, okay, so they made the Hunger Games like an actual thing. And he was just hoping it was just going to die out because, viewership was down, especially during the 10th annual Hunger Games. So they have to, they were implementing so many new things that, first drafts of things that obviously you see within the Hunger Games saga with Katniss.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's so guilty. And he's just like, he's always in this like dismembered state. Like, it's almost as if like, it's just all a dream. Like, one day, like I'll fall asleep and wake up and like none of this ever happens. And it's great how they were able to show like, this is why Highbottom hates Coriolanus so much, because of what his father did. And then Coriolanus is not making it any easier. He's like,
but here's the thing about it though. It does circle back to the showmanship of it all, right? Because from Snow's perspective, it's mostly from a place of ignorance and perhaps from a dubiousness of what to believe.
Right.
He just wanted to win, whether it be for Lucy Gray or himself or the both of them. It wasn't really, at least not initially, it wasn't about reinvigorating the games from some broader political standpoint. It certainly makes for some great dramatic irony, but Snow just wanted to win at all costs, even if it meant him becoming his father in a way he didn't realize until after the fact. He just needed that prize money.
Yeah.
And so the irony is fantastic, but I do love that it's a little bit more innocent than I'm going to be just like my dad and I'm going to make the Hunger Games this horrible spectacle. That comes later. But in this moment, it really isn't used for that. It's about him trying to do what's right for himself or for Lucy Gray, maybe both. Again, I love the murkiness of that.
Yeah.
And again, it mostly circles back to what we said earlier. Him in the games, it becomes these stepping stones to him losing his humanity. That's really what it is for Snow in the end. But from Highbottom's perspective, it's really more about that irony that he's reinvigorating something that he's trying to destroy. Highbottom's biggest flaw is that he didn't see Snow or his father as mutually exclusive, which again makes for fascinating irony given the final scene of the film. But you have to wonder if Coriolanus ends up differently than his father, as we noted earlier, if his trust in the process had been given an opportunity to Sprout. If he had just been given his prize money that he had earned, High Bottom sending him to become a peacekeeper is what eventually gives way to Snow's nihilism. And in an indirect way, it becomes the downfall for High Bottom. Again, more irony there.
Yeah, I feel so bad for High Bottom because he's just like he's kind of like Squidward almost in a way. Like he just doesn't like anyone or anything, and he's like, well, like things are what they are, and yeah, it's almost as if he's expecting the son to pay for the sins of the father. And then, yeah, like you said, it's not like Coriolanus knew what his father was doing. He was just trying to, impress Dr. Gall right up the draft. Yeah. Like he was just doing exactly what he was told. And it's just so
because
happened.
He needs the money.
Yeah.
That's why showing us that his family comes from nothing really. They have no status. They have no money. They're about to be evicted out of their home. It's not as if he's as privileged as everyone else is, at least compared to his peers. Compared to the districts, yes, he's very privileged. But compared to his peers, he doesn't really have much. And that prize money means everything. So again, the trust he has with Lucy Gray, is it real or is it a facade? It could be a little bit of both. Or maybe he's just being manipulative. I don't think he's being as manipulative as I think maybe Lucy Gray is. So maybe we could talk about her.
Oh, yes, because it's like Grandmam says, she has not been a girl in a very long time.
Do you think, and again, since we've been kind of in spoilers here for a little bit, do you think that she was playing him the whole time? Or do you think it was her seeing his hopelessness starting to come through there in the end?
I think it's the latter. I don't think she was playing him the entire time.
I agree. And to me, that's what makes her a way more fascinating character. If she was completely scheming the entire time, one, it doesn't make her any better than him in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe she's forced into this situation.
Right.
I want to be fair. When you're forced into this oppressive state, look, you're going to survive at all cost.
Right.
So it's hard to put any blame on her in that regard. So maybe I retract that statement a little bit. But it is a little bit more, it's a lot less innocent. I'll just put it that way. If she was scheming him,
she grew up. She grew up young for sure.
But maybe that is indicative of she quote unquote hasn't been a little girl in a long time. But I tend to believe, I'm with you. I don't think that she was manipulating him the whole time. I think it really comes down to some of the choices that he makes there in the third act, such as killing those two right in front of her, and her starting to realize that he's lying to her a little bit. And I think she just loses trust.
Yeah. Because she said trust is the most important thing, even over love. Like that is like her golden rule. Like that is the standard that she has. And in a lot of ways, she's not wrong, because if you can't trust anyone, how do you expect to love that person? And so it's kind of like trust is like the number one thing. And it's like going back to she's like, we all have a duty to like not cross that line. But she's not innocent. She's not naive in the slightest. Like, yeah, she can be sly, but I think that's just her growing up young, because she's a part of this traveling nomadic group known as the Covey, which is also the Covey. Like the word Covey actually means like a flock of birds. So I've mentioned this
flock of mockingjays.
Yeah. And I firmly believe, and I don't know if people would agree with this, but like Lucy Gray is the original Mockingjay, not in the same way that Katniss was during her revolution, but the Mockingjay itself is a byproduct of the capital's Jabberjay birds and the domestic mocking birds. who were it was to believe that the Jabberjays could not mate with the domestic birds of Panem, but they started mating with the mockingbirds, and the mockingjay is like the is the result, which it's not necessarily capital, not necessarily, of the districts, which is what the Covey were. They didn't necessarily belong to any district. As Lucy Gray say, we go as the fancy takes us, and they somehow just ended up in 12, and that's when the peacekeepers rounded them up, and that's just kind of where they've stayed, because where else are they going to go?
Either way, what it exhibits is that Lucy Gray and the people of the districts are obviously given the dichotomy of the capital and its culture versus those in the districts. The people of the districts are much more in tune with nature and how it functions, for the lack of a better phrase, I guess. So she, and I think we can presume many people in District 12 or any surrounding district, knows these animals and what they're capable of, and it certainly comes through. It's the symbolic fortitude isn't there like it is with Katniss, but it is very clear that she's as aware of her surroundings as Katniss would be like 50 years later, which is, obviously fascinating to see. Now, I do want to pose this question as we start to wind down here. I know we're going a little long. Do you think, and again, we're getting into some spoilers here, because the last final scenes we see with Lucy Gray, she betrays Snow, and then it's ambiguous as to what happens with her. And as of right now, it is, as you can imagine, sparked a ton of conspiracy theories.
Oh, yes.
So where do you stand on that? Do you think, and I've seen this a lot out there, I assume you have as well, do you buy into the theory that she is related to Katniss in some way?
Yes, I do, because I've known about some of these theories for a while, and I'm
because
glad
of the
you brought
books
this up.
and all that stuff.
Yeah, but I believe that Lucy Gray Baird is related to Katniss, not directly, but through Lucy Gray's cousin, Maud Ivory. I believe that Maud Ivory is Katniss's grandmother on her father's side.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is okay. I'm glad that you articulated it that way, and I probably haven't wrestled with this as much as many others have, because again, I just saw this film the other day and I haven't read the novel quite yet. So I am fresh with all of this material. But coming out of the theater, my thought process was, I don't think that she's related, at least not directly, such as her being Katniss's grandmother, for example, because Katniss's mother would have known if her mother was in the Hunger Games, or at least I think it's safe to presume that. Even if she didn't, there would have been public record of Lucy Gray being in the games, something that Katniss likely would have had access to when she became a part of that same process. Or if the Capitol had erased those records to keep them from Katniss, I feel like that would have been brought up in the movies, because that's kind of a big deal.
Okay.
Either way.
Sorry, go ahead.
Like a direct connection to me feels forced, and it leaves too many open-ended questions. I really hope the references to Katniss are nothing more than that they're just references. I will admit there are vivid parallels between Katniss and Lucy Gray, for sure. There's, of course, the Hanging Tree song, which could explain why it has deep meaning to Katniss. But personally, I don't like the theory that
everyone's related to someone
they're
else.
just direct, because it feels
it's
manufactured. Yes, and to me, it just cheapens. It cheapens the moment in Catching Fire a little bit when she starts singing that. If it's But if it's a little bit more, if it's slightly off the beaten path, as you're suggesting, I can live with that, I guess.
So you actually hit on something very important. Can I talk about a book spoiler? That this is something that they actually.
I haven't read the book.
Never mind. I can't.
Christian.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I won't
bring
say
this.
anything.
Save it. Write it
Save it.
down.
All right.
And we'll circle back next summer. Okay.
I got you. Okay. So yeah, forget what I was gonna say there. But yes, there's a lot of theories online that, number one, did Lucy Gray survive? Because that is something that is left ambiguous in the film as much as it is in the books. So, obviously if Katniss was related to Lucy Gray, we would need to have known if she definitively, survived or not.
Yeah, that's step one. Yeah.
But oh man, there's so many things that it
honestly,
could be.
I don't think there's anything wrong with leaving it as a moment of reverence toward Katniss and foreshadowing to Katniss. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The way they invoke her name, I actually think is really quite innocent.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because now we know what the name Katniss means. And it's something that is so innocuous. It's part of everyday living. Again, the whole idea that these people are in tune with nature, the nature around them.
Yeah.
That for her mother to pull that out to name her daughter makes a lot of sense. I'm perfectly fine with that. Or again, the idea that this song originates in District 12. We see the literal hanging tree. We see a couple of literal hangings in the film.
Right.
So it adds poignancy to this film. And, and it makes sense that song would be passed down through the generations all the way to Katniss's time. And it's not like you're that far removed. The song would still carry a lot of poignancy at that time.
Right.
So I can buy that. I think maybe the references might be a little heavy-handed, but I think it's handled with enough diligence from Francis Lawrence's perspective.
Right.
That especially if it's just shown in reverence and it's nothing more than that, then I think it's great.
Yeah.
But if it's trying to allude to, she's actually Katniss's grandma. Get out.
No, I don't.
Get out of here.
Yeah, I don't think that's it. So the references to Katniss and I love as soon as they're saying, some people call it Swan Potato, but we refer to her as Katniss, and then her theme starts,
love that.
blowing
Perfectly
up.
fine
It's
with that.
Yes. But so there's also the theory that Lucy Gray becomes President Coin, which I do not agree with.
Get out of here with that.
I'm telling
those
you,
two
man,
characters. No, get out of here. What is that? The Will Ferrell thing? Get out of here. No, absolutely
I don't
not.
like that theory at all. I don't.
Dude, did people not see Mockingjay Part 2? Did they not see what she did? You do understand that Coin and what we see here, that's not the same character. Not even close.
No, it's
not even just in terms of action and who they are personally. As you talked about earlier, the kind of whole Southern vibe, the whole Nashville vibe is not Coin. I hate to tell you, I don't think she would just change overnight like that.
Exactly. Yeah. There's people who are like, oh, well, Coin dresses in a lot of gray, and it's
get out of here.
It's probably the worst theory I've ever heard. But
that's dumb. No,
through Maud Ivory, because in the Hunger Games books, Katniss's father is very influential towards her, and her singing the Meadow song like she does Saru. That song appears in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes books, but they didn't put it in the movie. I was a little sad about that because I kind of like that song. But
that
a lot of
main
the songs,
theme though.
Yeah,
that James Newton Howard throws in that main Katniss theme.
Yeah, I love
when they go to District 12, and I'm not gonna lie, I got real giddy.
Oh yeah, I was like,
I got real excited.
It's so good.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, no, he definitely hit me there. I will say this, and then we can wind down here. I know because of Star Wars and all of its connective tissue, I think we're starting to see this in the MCU a lot as well.
Yeah.
There is absolutely nothing wrong. It's perfectly okay. Just accept it. It's perfectly okay if it's ambiguous, if there's
love it.
no answer to any. And it's also okay if it's just shown in reverence. Like they don't have to be connected. They don't.
Yeah.
And I don't know what Suzanne Collins is going to do. If she's going to write another novel, if she'll explore this further. If she does connect them, we'll have to wait and see how that works. If she does it well, then maybe it'll be great in execution. Who knows? We'll have to wait and judge it when we get there. But as it stands now, and if she never addresses it and it's just left in ambiguity, that's great. That's fine.
Because
great art does that.
That's what I love about this story. A lot happens in this book, and of course, obviously in the film. And there's so much left on the table up in the air where it's like, Lucy Gray was named after the Ballad of Lucy Gray, where the song that she sings in the film, where they're kind of like out in the lake, where like a girl gets like lost in the snow.
Yeah.
Her parents go to find her. Her tracks kind of stop.
I see.
Exactly. She's lost in the snow. So much symbolism.
That's not on the nose at all.
But I love the ambiguity. Like you said, if Suzanne Collins never mentions it, that's fine. It could just be that she created Lucy Gray to give some type of familiarity to those who may even start with the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and then goes onto the Hunger Games books or films, because it's like, oh, let's do like another girl in District 12. She's the opposite of Katniss, even though there are a lot of parallels, but it could just be the familiarity of having a girl from District 12, because that is, out of the 12 districts, I think it's like District 8 and 12. They're like the runt of the litter when it comes to like Pan Am. Like, I mean, it's Call, like, in District 12, like nobody, they've had two victors outside of Katniss. That was Haymitch and Lucy Gray, and that's it.
Yeah.
And Peter.
Absolutely. I will say this, my last final thought, and then we can wind down. If Suzanne Collins and by proxy the films want to pursue this further, I think there's a couple of angles. I do think it would be genuinely interesting, even though at this point it's a little bit more conclusive as to where Snow is going to go. But as it's not often that we get a whole movie from the antagonist perspective.
Right.
In the sense that, okay, Snow at this point is full on nihilistic. However, I still would watch a movie of him doing the political angling and the big brother thing of trying to manipulate to get his way to the top.
Yeah, that'd be.
I would be interested in that. The other thing I've heard out there that I think is also fascinating is Tigress and how she became who she is, because we do see her in Mockingjay Part 2, and she says something about how their relationship deteriorated, and of course the way she looks is very different because of that relationship and how it unravels. That would be an interesting perspective as well, to see how she goes from innocent cousin, as we see here, to who she is in Mockingjay Part 2. I think would be really interesting. So, those are a couple of angles that you could certainly take a look at, or maybe take another piece of history here that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah.
And just really do something new.
Yeah.
Like what Andor did with Star Wars. That's different. It's invigorating. It's fresh. It has nothing to do with anything that we've seen previously, or very little, obviously connected to Rogue One, but I don't know, something like that maybe. And I think there's still a lot to explore in this universe. It's rich and dense, and of course the whole revolution part of it that eventually comes. Like, there's going to be a build up to that. I think there's plenty that this series can mine still.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm curious if they want to pull from it, but it might also depend, Christian. I mentioned earlier, this film is a far cry from the other films in terms of opening box office. Now,
Mhm.
we live in a different world. Post-pandemic is
Right.
very different than what it was pre-pandemic. Mockingjay Part 2, its opening was still 102 million,
Mm.
which, isn't great, but I don't think is, it's not bad either,
Right.
especially compared to this. Like, that's double what Songbirds and States did in its opening at
Yeah.
45. So I don't know if the Hunger Games, if people are craving more of these movies. I don't know. I think they're very good though. I've loved this entire franchise,
yeah.
including Songbirds and Snakes. So I would love for them to see more.
No,
We'll see if the
seriously.
business is there.
Yeah, it's like you said, like we could get a movie about either Hamish's Hunger Games, or we can get a movie about how the revolution started, like what happened to District 13. Like
Yeah.
there's so much political, like obviously the games are always going to be there. There's 75 Hunger Games that they could probably go through.
And to be clear, I was talking, the numbers I had in front of me were domestic,
Right.
because worldwide right now this film is at $100 million. Whereas like Catching Fire worldwide was close to $1 billion. It was 865, I believe.
Yeah.
That first Hunger Games was 694 worldwide. So like these movies, they still did very well overall.
Right.
Not just, domestically, yes, but worldwide they did extremely well. I mean, Mockingjay Part 2, I said was the least domestically, 653 worldwide.
That's still a lot. Yeah.
You're doing great. You're
Right.
you're doing fine, honey. You're doing fantastic. Keep going.
The odds are in your favor.
The odds are definitely in your favor. So like, and who's to say that this doesn't have, some longevity to it? Like word of mouth, the reviews.
Yeah.
I don't know where the reviews are, but word of mouth might drive this a little bit, and people might head to the theater and see this. So, I mean, $100 million right now is fine. We'll see where it makes up. So it's still a far cry from the other four.
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll judge it when it's all said and done.
Yeah.
So anyway,
pandemic. Yeah. And how people watch movies is so different now.
Exactly.
So it's like,
and that's the thing. Like, okay, the other major factor here, part of the reason Brennan is not here having this conversation with us is that it was 2.5 hours. In a post-pandemic world where streaming is in way more abundance than it ever has been, that is probably a big reason. I don't want to say it's completely a turn off, because if this year has taught us anything, people will go to the movies to see long movies.
Oh yeah.
Killers of the Flower Moon, Oppenheimer, to name a few. Oppenheimer doing, $1 billion.
Avatar last year.
Avatar last year. Yeah. That was almost 3 hours. So long movies don't necessarily have to keep, or for it to be the singular thing that keeps people away. I don't know if the audience is there comparatively to maybe a Nolan or even, although I feel like now we're getting in the weeds. I think part of Oppenheimer's success is the whole Barbenheimer part of it.
100%.
I don't know if $1 billion is on the table without the Barbenheimer thing. However, it did garner close to $1 billion. You noted Avatar. So it's a part of the equation. I'll just say that. That's a lot of words to say. I'm curious what the streaming numbers for this would be, because if I had to guess, the streaming and maybe rental numbers will be fairly good. If I had to guess.
Yeah.
So.
And like 2.5 hours, this is really only like 15 minutes longer than like the first Hunger Games movie.
Yes.
It's like, it's all about pacing too, but I don't know. There's so many factors. Like,
all right. Well, since we're getting kind of long here, we're almost at an hour and a half with this review. So we'll go ahead and wind down here. We're both big fans of the movie. Please go and see it if you haven't already. Christian, thanks for being here, man. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. Like, oh my gosh, like I'm so happy I was able to, make this work and talk Hunger Games with you again. So it's
great time, man.
People just go see it. It's a great time. The Hunger Games fans seem to be enjoying it as well.
Tell us where we can find you on social media. And
Oh
where
my
can we find
gosh,
your
you can
work?
find us on all the social media garbage on Twitter, Threads, Instagram, and you can find our audio only podcasts on podcast platforms around the internet, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, you name it. Yeah, at Film Optics, that is optics with an X, OPTIX. And yeah, we're covering Hunger Games as well. And yeah, I'm just so happy to be here, man. I
Yeah.
hope the fans have the odds in their favor with the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes.
Yeah,
They do.
absolutely. I agree. Please go and check out all of Christian's work and please give him a follow. I really do appreciate you, good sir. With that, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay tuned for the main show this weekend. Brendan and I will be doing a little bit of a catch-up episode talking about some movies that we won't give full reviews on, but we wanted to talk about them on the show. And we'll have a review for The Holdovers coming soon as well. So with all of that said, thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, man. What a fun movie. So good.
Caesar Flickerman signing out.